Very good. Okay. So now, without further, well, now I've got a bad feedback. Is that going live?
Are all your remote participants
I
muted?
think if you mute the other mic, then it should be okay.
Check.
So ironically, when you speak, in fact,
It's coming out of there into here.
yeah, when you speak, they've got to hear what you're saying. So
It just is.
It just is.
Very good. So you guys, I'm sorry to say you will have a small feedback, and I hope that doesn't bother you too much. So without further ado, let's get this moving. We got timelines and ferries to catch, I assume. First question is directed about housing.
The opening remarks.
Oh yeah, you get opening remarks. I said that.
Okay.
Thank you. So without further ado, we'll start with opening remarks. And we'll start with Mr. John Weston. You'll have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, audience. I apologize for the inconvenience, for the change in time, but here we are, and we are dedicated to conveying our messages to you. I was the Member of Parliament between 2008 and 2015 for this great riding. I had the honor to bring 2 private members' bills into fruition, tackling crystal meth and national health and fitness day. I had 3 others on deck when Parliament was adjourned in 2015, and 4 things that were incorporated into Budget 2015 came from the wonderful people of this riding through me. It was an honor to serve. I didn't necessarily expect to be back, but the direction in which our country's going caused me to think that it was time to roll up my sleeves and get moving again. I didn't expect this morning to be moving our discussion as we've had to do because of a accommodation we had to do relating to the whole question of viruses and our response to those things. What I expected to
1 minute.
talking about this today was an unnecessary election into which we've been plunged, an election during a time of a pandemic, when BC was burning, and when our friends in Afghanistan, who ought to have been evacuated months ago, have been stranded because of a prime minister who thought it was important instead to focus on this election. I thought we'd be talking about a fragile economy, an economy that has been buffeted with a rising cost of living, with challenges to find workers, especially on the Sunshine Coast, and people struggling to find good jobs. 1 million jobs were lost during this pandemic. In this election, we have a stark choice between a comprehensive plan offered by the Conservatives, one that will restore the economy, that will secure the future, that will bring back those 1 million jobs, that will bring 1 million houses within 3 years, and will restore Canada's role on the international stage. The alternative is
Thanks, John.
continuance of a reckless Trudeau, supported by the Greens and the NDP.
Thanks a lot for your opening remarks.
Lots more to discuss.
Perfect. Thanks, John. And we'll move on next to Mr. Patrick Weiler. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Keith. And I just want to again begin by acknowledging that I'm streaming from the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish Nation and thank them for the stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. And thank you to the organizers for being able to pivot to doing this online and for everybody for tuning in on short notice. Many of you will know I've been your MP for the last couple of years, but I come from a background in environmental law and Aboriginal law, and I've worked in BC and around the world. But I grew up on the Sunshine Coast over in Sechelt, where my mother was a municipal councillor. But the reason I got into politics were the unfair laws that the Harper administration brought in when they completely gutted environmental laws in 2012. And it was due to working international development at a time when Canada was a global pariah for doing nothing on climate change and for being the biggest impediment to global action in the world. In the last 6 years, more has been done to improve environmental sustainability than any 6 years in our country's history. In the last 2 years, I've spent being the hardest working MP this riding has ever seen. And that's the commitment that I'll make again to you today if re-elected. And that work has certainly borne fruit. Over $130 million in infrastructure and program investments have been made in the riding just in the last 2 years. And we've showed we've been able to be there for Canadians and Canadian enterprises over the last couple of years while passing some of the most important legislation on climate and reconciliation in our country's history. So I'm running to represent you again because while we've done a lot of work, there's much to be done. We need to finish the fight against COVID-19. We need to ensure our economy continues to recover. And we need to deal with some of the challenges that really have been highlighted. And we're the only party that has a clear plan to do that. And I'm looking forward to talking about that a little bit more over the next hour and a half.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. So now we will move on to Mr. Terry Grimwood. Terry, you have the floor for 2 minutes. Oh, okay. We're moving a microphone.
Good evening. My name's Terry Grimwood, and this is my third election try. I'm an independent candidate, and I want you to seriously consider voting for an independent candidate. I believe that I can do more for the community as an independent than I could for the parties that are presently represented. When I was a young boy skiing at Garibaldi Lifts in 1965, you could homestead in the Pemberton Valley, and we're looking for solutions for housing. I would like to see homesteading introduced right across the country, and I had suggested having hubs every 50 kilometers in rural Canada and throughout the country. And with those hubs, there would be an opportunity to support policing, immigration, and the hubs could specialize in different industries and food production.
If I could suggest you put that computer back on that desk, you might separate the mics and prevent that feedback.
The candidates won't see you.
Most
The people
Well, can't you use that camera there?
Is that camera working?
It is, but because we only have the one computer to encode the stream, we
do I get to finish my time?
Yeah, he never did finish this time. It's still going.
So these cameras aren't even functional?
they are.
Mr. Bev, this is Mr. Grimwood's time.
Apologies, I thought.
Well, I'm sorry, I was just totally distracted by everybody moving everything and you getting up and moving
I had
yourself.
to go ask a question. I apologize.
This isn't working for everybody.
You're right. We're adjusting. We're pivoting.
Anyhow, the forest fires are the biggest problem we have in Canada, and 3 years ago when I ran for public office in the South Burnaby by-election, I made, using the military, Air Force, Canada needs more water bombers and helicopters right across the country. I'm flabbergasted that the Native community are supporting the Liberal government. It's their lands that have been devastated in Canada. And they're still willing to support this government. It doesn't make any sense to me. Mr. Trudeau suggested giving funds for 1,000 more people to be trained in firefighting and equipment. He's got more than 1,000 people cutting lawn in Ottawa. Canada's second largest landmass in the world, longest coastline, and we're treating it like we're a village. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grimwood. Kindly ask Mr. Avi Lewis. You have the floor for 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I am glad to be here with you all, also in Squamish territory, and riding this unpredictable day. And I think we're entering a new and concerning juncture in the campaign. Tonight's event was upset by a shared concern among the majority of the candidates that the public wasn't properly informed of a choice by one of the candidates to run on a platform of rejecting public health orders and of being proudly anti-vaccination. People have a right to decide what they put in their body, but they also have a responsibility when they're running for public life to keep others safe. And so we came together as candidates,
1 minute.
begging the forgiveness of the organizers who did their best to try to come up with a solution, and here we are. I'm glad that John Weston's here with us tonight. We've missed him at the previous meetings because I think it helps people see that we're in a really perilous moment in our country's history, and it's been born of Tory and Liberal governments alike. Housing prices are spiraling out of control. In the last 6 years, the housing crisis that the Tory government was responsible for, a spiraling market failure of speculation, on rampant speculation that has deprived an entire generation of young people of the opportunity to own a home, has only been increased by the Liberal government. House prices in Vancouver up more than $400,000 in the Trudeau era. And we're in a climate emergency, which the Harper years of climate denial, of putting the fossil fuel industry above all other concerns in our country, the Trudeau government has doubled down on that, giving $18 billion to the fossil fuel industry in the last year alone, and buying a pipeline and claiming they needed the revenue to fund climate action. So we are in an emergency, overlapping emergencies, thanks to Tory and Liberal governments together.
Thank you.
It's good to have everyone in the room to take responsibility for where we find ourselves.
Thank you.
And I'll be talking about the hopeful solutions that the NDP is offering.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. All right, and moving on, we'll move to Mr. Doug Bebb. We have to float the... Getting good.
Getting there.
We're getting there, right?
You want that thing over here too?
It's coming.
The only camera?
It's coming.
Okay, thank you. Should I get closer, or is that adequate for volume?
It's good, it's strong.
Okay, it's good and strong.
And if you don't mind, 2 minutes, sir.
All right, let me get my clock going here. Well, I'll just forget about that.
I got it.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming, or tuning in anyways. Thank you to Chris Nichols and to the Gibsons Chamber of Commerce for hosting this event. My name is Doug Bebb, and I am the People's Party candidate for the 44th general election. I am a retired, semi-retired anyways, mechanical engineer and MBA, currently living at Whistler with my wife, Franca. I have a long history both at Whistler and on the Sunshine Coast that dates back to childhood. During my professional career, I lived in various locations across Canada and the United States and have acquired an appreciation of people in all regions of this country. A student of both history and geopolitics with a good knowledge of international affairs, I'm a father, an outdoor enthusiast, and an instrument-rated private pilot. While I previously viewed politics as a lost cause due to corruption, the arrival of Maxime Bernier and the People's Party provided the glimmer of hope needed to convince me to enter the fray for the first time in 2019 at the age of 62. I appreciate Max's straightforward, principled approach to politics and find all of the PPC policies to my liking. All of our policies must pass the 4 founding principles of individual freedom, responsibility, fairness, and respect. The result of this PPC policy is being best described as classical liberal and fiscally conservative. The People's Party is populist in its organization and is the only party with the courage to speak openly about the tough issues of the day. The most recent of these is vaccine passports and forced vaccinations. We are against these because they violate our PPC principles of individual freedom and respect. We are neither pro-vax nor anti-vax. We are pro-choice and insist that the health choices made by individuals be respected by governments. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Okay.
Not coming close to 2 minutes?
Yeah, you were 30 seconds off, 20 seconds off.
20 seconds.
Nailed it.
Sped up too much.
And as we get set up here, we'll get ready for Mr. Mike Simpson. If you don't mind, you could go now if you like.
Well, good evening, everyone.
think tonight is actually a little bit of a microcosm of the global systemic shocks that are going on around the planet right now. And COVID is just about one. We have COVID disrupting things all over the place. And life is difficult to adapt to. And we know through evolution that you either adapt to these changes or you die. Nothing works, right? That's how evolution works. And right now, the same challenges are going to happen with climate change. The next few decades are going to be some of the most difficult periods of time for us as a human species, and we are going to have to adapt and to cooperate and find a way forward in which we can cross partisan lines to get through an emergency. And tonight, I'm actually very proud that we were able to come together and realize that we were in an untenable situation and that there was a solution.
1 minute.
And this is the solution that we're in right now, which is a Zoom call in which we can still have public discourse on the subjects that we want. It's the same kind of cooperation that we in the Green Party, and me in particular, I feel that we can also do for climate change. We can step aside with our differences for a moment and realize, wow, this one is life-threatening. It's going to affect you, your children, future generations, and it's now. And if we don't actually find solutions in which we can brainstorm together to adapt quickly, as we did tonight, respecting each other but adapting quickly. And there will be deniers. And to those deniers, I say, I don't have time. We don't have time for that right now. People will try to deny climate change, I'm sorry. And if you're going to try and deny the COVID, I'm sorry. But the rest of us have to get together, put our heads together, and concentrate on the solutions. And there are many good solutions you're going to hear tonight in the room. And I, for one, am committed to trying to cooperate with all peoples who want to cooperate on that, on the global systemic shocks that we're in, whether it's COVID or climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. So that concludes the first question. Anybody just tuning in, the hiccups tonight, we've had to kind of pivot. We were going away from what we originally planned, but we've still got all 6 candidates here tonight, and we'll continue on with the questions now. So Patrick Weiler, you'll be first in this round, and the housing and the question will be directed towards housing. The 4 local governments have endorsed an emergency housing call to action on the Sunshine Coast. Over 20 other signatories from groups on the Sunshine Coast, including our elected MP, Patrick Weiler. How would your government support local governments to ensure that we navigate this current dire situation, dire housing and rental situation, and ensure affordable housing in our community for the future? And Patrick, you have 2 minutes.
Thanks, Keith. And well, I think this is a really important question. And of all the candidates here, I'm the only one that's part of Generation Speaks. And the same challenges and the same challenges of affordable housing on the Sunshine Coast are similar right throughout our riding, right throughout our region. And actually, increases in cost of housing are happening right across the country. So I feel this acutely, and when the idea of home ownership is getting out of people's reach, that's an emergency concern, and that's why I've been an active participant as part of the emergency community housing meetings, and I was a signatory to that list that you just mentioned. I've also been having bi-weekly meetings with our elected officials in the riding, so that's all the mayors, that's the head of the SCRD, and the Highwest Paul from the Sechelt Nation, looking at where there are opportunities to build more affordable housing. It's also proactively reaching out to the nonprofit community housing providers on the Sunshine Coast that are all doing really great work right now, and they need some support. We've brought in over the last, since 2017,
1 minute.
a $72 billion plan called the National Housing Strategy to build more affordable housing. But on top of this, what we've proposed within our platform this year is a comprehensive plan to deal with housing affordability more generally. So that includes both on the demand side, looking at things like creating a new tax-free savings account so people can save up for their first home, doubling tax credits through the first-time homebuyers incentive, among other things on the demand side. It also includes things like a home buyer's bill of rights, which will ban rent evictions, ban blind bidding, create more transparency in the market, and create a special office for looking at financial crimes, including money laundering. That has been identified as one of the measures that's pushing up the cost of real estate. So we have the most comprehensive plan. In our next answer, I'm going to get into some of the solutions we have on the supply side. but it's going to require a cooperative approach working across all orders of government, and we have that on the Sunshine Coast right now.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. Moving on, we'll move on to Mr. Terry Grimwood. We'll just have to move the mic and screen here. Terry, you have 2 minutes, whenever you like.
Thank you. I'm an independent candidate, but I believe I'm the only one in this group of candidates, and there are no women, unfortunately, on the ballot this time, which is very sad. But I'm the only candidate that has been a licensed builder in British Columbia. I've built dozens of homes, and I know what is broken when it comes to housing. I was a licensed builder building in Sechelt, and what slowed me down with the acres of land that I had were the development cost charges that the district of Sechelt wanted to levy. They were wanting $23,000 a door, regardless of the square footage of the building that was being built. For building a small cottage, a studio, 400, 500, 600 square feet, the development cost charges shouldn't be the same as they would be for a 2,000 or 3,000 square foot home. And that was the case. So the DCCs have to come down. I mentioned earlier homesteading. We need to make land available right across the country. And if you look at a city like Burnaby, Burnaby has $3-4 billion cash in the bank. They're the most successful municipality in all of Canada, and they have the ability to generate that kind of revenue from building housing. All the municipalities should be looking to Burnaby for guidance. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Home warranty limitations, someone wanting to build their own house. You're shut out with the warranty requirements that are in place today. And the time that it takes to get a permit is ridiculous. We should be able to hire a professional engineer and start construction on a Monday after your design is filed on a Friday prior. This time that it takes is ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, next we'll move on to Mr. Avi Lewis, if you could, 2 minutes.
So we're in a housing emergency. All four municipal governments have said the word emergency. They didn't say, hey, Liberal government, we need some incremental changes and some tweaks to the incentives. It's an emergency. Justin Trudeau said at the beginning of the campaign that the deck is stacked against Canadians when it comes to securing a home, a basic fundamental right to housing. Who dealt the hand? The Liberal government has unleashed a speculation spiral on the people of this country. Liberal candidates in neighboring ridings who have made millions and millions of dollars flipping homes in the last few years. And this was all laid by the market fundamentalism of the Harper government before it. We're in a long-term housing emergency. And there are people in this riding, low-income people in this riding, who are paying more than half their income on rent. 3/4 of the low-income people in this riding are paying more than half, on the Sunshine Coast, are paying more than half their income in rent. So we desperately need rental units, and we'll get into that in the next question. But we need to increase the housing supply on an emergency basis. We cannot rely on market mechanisms to get us out of market failure, and that is what we're in. The housing emergency is desperately deepening the divide in our society between the ultra-rich and the billionaire class, who have been well served by Tory and Liberal governments alike, and people who actually work for a living. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have a plan to build 500,000 units of non-market housing, acquiring and using federal land in consultation with First Nations to get the housing built fast and not fuel the market spiral, but co-op housing, non-profit housing, co-housing, and public housing. Let us dare to say the P word, public housing, need to come back in this country in a huge way, and the federal government has a responsibility to step up. We cannot leave this emergency to the market.
Wow. Well timed. I'm just going to mention something before we move on. It's Doug's turn now, but I'm just going to mention something that both the candidates, the last two candidates, have mentioned in the next question. Everybody at home and in the audience here, everybody's been briefed on all of the questions that we will be asking tonight. I don't think I said that in my intro. So we'll move on to Mr. Doug Bebb.
What do you mean by briefed?
I think something fell there. I don't know what it was.
I don't know what the questions are.
Thank you.
Well, I just got nominations closed on Monday at 2 o'clock.
Okay, in 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. Well, I'm sorry to say that the housing affordability is only going to get worse under a Liberal government. No amount of money thrown at the problem is going to help. In fact, throwing money at things is a big part of the problem. Like so many other things, affordability is decided by demand, supply, and disposable income. With massive immigration into Canada of 450,000 new immigrants per year, equal to the entire population of New Brunswick every 2 years, supply is never going to catch up. New Liberal promises to increase the housing stock carry the same lack of credibility, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and attendant corruption as all their previous promises. Then we need to consider the coming inflation that's baked into the economy by astronomical Liberal federal spending. Make no mistake, this insanity will come home to roost one way or another. The People's Party plan for this, and for many other things, is simple. Cut immigration to the bare minimum required for the Canadian economy, capped at 150,000 per year, and institute a sound monetary policy with a zero inflation target rate for the Bank of Canada. The free market will solve our current housing problems, just as long as regulation is kept to a minimum, as Terry so aptly pointed out. Of course, it is the Green Party that's advocating for greatly increased regulation on new construction, which will largely increase building costs. And I just have a quick minute here. I want to point out that this plan to increase by 500,000 housing units of the Greens, I think it was, is only a drop in the bucket compared to the 1.8 million immigrants that would arrive in this country over the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Moving on, we'll now hear from Mr. Mike Simpson.
I think that the housing market is actually quite complex in terms of the market distortions. We can say that there's a supply problem, but ironically, at times there's plenty of empty homes in Sunshine Coast that are actually sitting vacant, or they're being Airbnb. So when we listen to people locally about how we can solve that, we do hear people saying we need to address the short-term rental problem. We also need to address the fact that we do need public housing and we do need purpose-built rental homes. Because if people just build homes and they can make more money by selling those homes in a speculative market, they'll sell those homes. And we'll have homes that are sitting empty with no renters. So we end up losing either way. We need both market solutions and public policy solutions that will get us to move forward. And we definitely have to increase the supply of purpose-built, multi-age housing that fits into the image of what we want in our communities. Because I do believe that elders want to be able to live and age in place. Low-income people want to be able to live in multi-unit, multi-generational, multi-income housing.
1 minute.
And we can do that if we envision it. This is actually not, it's one of where we actually have to sit people down and go, let's stop bickering about whose responsibility it is, because it's actually multi-levels of government that must solve this problem. It's not just the feds. It will require municipalities and the province to be involved, and nonprofits to be involved, and cooperatives to be involved. All of the people that have proven in the past that they can actually find affordable solutions could come together if they felt it was an emergency, which it is. And it is the federal government's role, in my opinion, to be able to facilitate that discussion so that we can find all of these clever solutions to be able to pull it forward. And I'm very proud that the Green Party is putting numbers on the table. I don't believe some of the numbers that other parties are putting on the table. They strike me as incredibly ambitious, but I like the idea that they're doing that. I like the idea that people are thinking ambitiously about this. And if we can sit down and figure out how do we actually build these purpose-built houses using both markets and public policy together. That's the way to be able to solve this affordable housing issue. And by far, let's drive it with the people that need it.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Moving on, we'll hear from John Weston.
Well, thank you. I agree with Michael that it's a complex problem, and you would think that the party that triggered the election would have a comprehensive plan, but if you were watching, the Liberals delivered their plan only today, and if I were Patrick, I'd be scrambling to digest what was in there. You know, the Conservative plan has been out there for 2 weeks. It's comprehensive, and it recognizes that, yes, there's a problem if you're on the Sunshine Coast and you're like many who need housing. Yes, there's a problem if you're an entrepreneur and you can't get people to work for you because they can't find a place to live. The problem of attracting employees is partly because the cynical Prime Minister extended the CERB handily a month beyond the election. But the other contributor to that problem is the problem of housing. So the Conservative plan involves 1 million new homes within 3 years. And part of that is banning foreign ownership for at least 2 years of homes, so that this game of speculating in homes from offshore would be brought to a close.
1 minute.
At the same time, there's an encouragement of foreign investment in purpose-built rental housing because, as a couple of the others have said, we have to improve the stock of rental housing. Another part of the plan is, of the 37,000 federal buildings, 15% of those would be released, reformatted for residential purposes. It would be easier to get mortgages so that the stress test would be lessened. And this is really important. Though there are people in the Liberal camp who are talking about imposing a principal residence capital gains tax, Conservatives would never introduce that. That would be just a crisis for homeowners in this riding. Finally, on homelessness, a real specific response, building 1,000 long-term beds for people with addiction problems and 50 new drug treatment centers across the country. So right across the spectrum, a good comprehensive plan, something that could really work.
Thanks, John. We'll be moving on now to the next question, still in the housing realm. So the question is, will the governments provide incentives for the construction of new purpose-built rentals? An example being an accelerated capital cost allowance or removing the GST. We'll start first with Mr. Grimwood as we move everything again.
Is that the right question?
I just rewrote it. It's the same question.
Could you read the question again, please?
Absolutely. Will the governments provide incentives for the construction of new purpose-built rentals? An example being accelerated capital cost allowance or removing the GST. You have 2 minutes starts now.
I believe that the government can play a role by providing land for housing, but I want to see housing built by house builders for profit. I want them to basically bid on the jobs and do the work. Canada pension funds are invested, 90% of our pension funds are invested all over the world. I want to see Canada pension funds come back to Canada and be invested in housing. Canadians are the proud owners of student housing in London, England. I don't know of one project in Canada where a pension fund has built or funded student housing. Not one. What's the reason for that? So going forward, we need to build housing. I mentioned Burnaby having a successful program for many, many years. Not just in the last 10 years, but for the last 30, 40 years. They have been leaders in building housing. But the pension funds have the ability to provide work for Canadians, and we'd get a real synergy from investing that money in Canada and building student housing, seniors housing. We have the land. Canada has the land right across the country. Let's give it to the communities and the rural areas and build really good quality housing. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your time. Moving up next, we'll go with Mr. Avi Lewis.
rental units by waiving the federal portion of the GST, HST. That'll get homes built faster, and they'll remain affordable longer. But that's not going to do it enough. People are living in crisis. And I want to reiterate that whether it's rental or home ownership, this crisis is rocking our community. Go and talk to people, administrators in the Seashell Hospital, who have multiple applicants for needed jobs in essential services in the hospital in the middle of a pandemic. And these great prospects come and take a look at the housing market here and say, no, I'm not taking that job. I'm withdrawing my application. People cannot afford to live in this riding because of the market failure that we're in. The myth of the market fixing these problems has devastated the living conditions for Canadians for decades now, and has led to the deepest inequality that we've ever had in our society. If you take a look at the Men's Health magazine that stands in for the Tory platform, sorry, John, I couldn't help it. It is a piece of political theater that will go down in history. It's like a wish, just a hope that 1 million homes will appear if you create the market conditions. We are in an emergency. We need action from government that will actually help people stay in their homes, find homes, create new homes from existing buildings. And the federal government has many levers at its fingertips to do this. One of the things that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP has proposed is $5,000 of emergency rent relief per year for families whose rents have gone up almost $5,000 just in the last few years. We've got to help working people. It's only the NDP that will fight for working people, that will fight for you, and will actually help people who are trying to live through this market emergency round.
That got wild. Sorry about that feedback. Unbelievable. Okay. Moving up, we'll go next with Mr. Doug Bebb. Wow.
Just getting too close to the mic, that's all. Well, I guess I could say that I kind of agree with Terry Grimwood that making land available would be a good option on the part of the federal government to spur new development, as well as decreasing regulations. But I think I'll take, we've answered this housing question once already tonight. So I think I'd like to say that the format of this debate was changed at the very last minute because the 4 establishment parties fled the scene claiming they did not feel safe despite rigorous adherence to COVID protocols by the Gibsons Chamber of Commerce. It was well done. It was unjustified. There was no need for it. Now, 4 days ago, we were on Bowen Island at Bowfest, and both Patrick Weiler and Avi Lewis were there among hundreds of people, rubbing elbows, unmasked, and the claim that they are unsafe here in a fully masked, properly outfitted protocol is absolute nonsense. These hypocrites need to explain their inconsistent behavior. And if I have any more time left, I'd like to address Avi Lewis's total nonsense, a total misrepresentation in this opening. As I clearly stated, the People's Party is neither pro-vaccine nor anti-vaccine, as Avi Lewis so falsely claims. We are pro-choice and trust Canadians to make their own health choices based upon complete information, which would include available therapeutics as well as vaccines. And that's not to be enforced by government or coerced by government. Thank you.
Great. Up next will be Mr. Mike Simpson.
The short answer to the organizers is yes. I think that market incentives are a good idea whenever we can find them. But I think that the larger picture here is how do we think of homes and houses? Because I think somebody recently said to me that I'm not homeless, I'm houseless. Because when you're homeless on the streets, you still have, when you're houseless on the streets, you still have a home in a community. And when we think about what is it that we want where people can live, what are the communities that we want, we have to think more holistically than just the housing crisis. It's also how do we find houses and places where people can live and work in the same place, where they can age in place, as I said, where they can actually find transportation so that they can afford not just their house, but they can afford to move around in the community where their quality of life improves. And when we take that more holistic picture of our communities, we can build a vision of a place that we actually want to live. And plenty of people want to live here for the environment and so on, but what they're having trouble with is the cost and the supply of homes. And I think that there is a way that we can quickly address that by actually building, like,
1 minute.
what we know works. I'll just say this over and over again. The solutions are out there. Just go and talk to the cooperatives, the associations, and the nonprofits that build these homes, and they'll quickly tell you, here's how to solve the problem. And that's what went wrong in the 1970s and 80s, is that we pulled back from supporting those groups. And that's where we had the housing deficit that we now have. We don't have low-income, multi-unit, multi-income homes where people can live and work in the same communities. So I think it's very important. What I'm getting at here is that we can't just look at one issue and say, if we just do capital cost allowance, the problem's going to go away. That's just not true. It's a good idea, do it. But we also have to take a look at the entire picture of what it is to live in community together in a way in which quality of life is what's driving our decisions. And quality of life is more than just whether or not you have a house, whether or not you have relations, whether you have access to schools, access to transportation, access to all those things that
Thanks, Mike.
is a good thing.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. Moving on, we'll move on to Mr. John Weston.
Well, thank you, Chris. The question is about increasing purpose-built rental housing. And, if you have a dream, you can talk in generalities. We conservatives have a plan. And yes, 1 million jobs in 3 years, it's planned out. We believe there would be a certain number of houses built anyway. And on top of that, we will move it up several 100,000 by working with municipalities and provincial governments to encourage the construction of houses near public transport. You get 2 bonuses there. That means that the taxpayer's investment in public transit gets leveraged, and then more far-flung areas get connected where you can build at more affordable rates. We're going to encourage foreigners to invest in purpose-built public housing. So the money that would have been channeled into speculative investment in homes will be invested directly in that. And here in the Sunshine Coast, I'm intrigued with the discussion about the Sunshine Coast Highway. Something's been discussed for years and years and years, which could lead to the opening up of lands, which could indeed be a place for more affordable housing. But beyond that, I have to say that Michael's reference to the quality of life of people is essential. And that's why conservatives have a plan to reboot the economy, to bring back jobs, to incentivize employers to hire people back. If people have an income, then of course they're more able to come here and at least start by renting and then move towards buying. So there's a specific goal to hire new people, 25% subsidy of their wages, and people who've been out of the workforce, unemployed for 6 months, up to 50% subsidy to bring people back in through the Conservative Job Search Plan. There's also other ways to reboot the economy. Just having a Conservative government come in that would be friendly to business and investors and employees, that's going to be a wholesome change.
Thanks, John. Moving on to wrap up on housing tonight, we'll talk to Mr. Patrick Weiler.
Thanks. Well, I just want to start by correcting something here. John mentioned that the Liberal Party is planning to bring in a tax on principal residence. This is a baseless rumor that's been perpetrated by the Conservative Party to instill fear in folks. It's been publicly refuted multiple times, and I would ask that he would stop circulating this baseless rumor. The issue of, or the option of building on federal lands has been brought up. There's a project that's been built on School Road through a project through the Federal Lands Initiative that we brought in, and providing supportive housing right now. But unfortunately, going forward, it's not really going to be a solution for the Sunshine Coast, just because there are not federal lands. What I would mention as well is, for over a decade under Harper, there was absolutely no investment from the federal government into affordable housing.
1 minute.
In 2017, the Liberal government brought in the National Housing Strategy, And over the course of the last 4 years since then, this has ramped up to a $72 billion over 10-year strategy. And a key part of this is what's called the Rental Construction Finance Initiative, where we're able to provide financing on the cost that the government can borrow at to build purpose-built rental stock. And so this has actually been very successful in getting hundreds of rental homes built in Whistler, in Squamish as well, and it's absolutely an option for the Sunshine Coast, and we've had multiple discussions with municipalities on here. And it's a key part of our plan to build more supply. Our plan is to build 1.4 million new homes or rebuild or repair existing homes, which is 30% more than the Conservatives have put forward. It also includes plans like rent-to-own buildings, a tax credit for secondary suites, which is really important for when you have multi-generational families, and doubling the National Co-Investment Fund. But one of the key things that we're going to do to really address the challenges is providing support through $4 billion to speed up the building approval process, which will do more than anything else to increase supply.
Thank you so much. We'll move on from housing now, and we'll move into water, maybe the biggest issue on the Sunshine Coast currently. So how will you as an elected official work with provincial and local governments to ensure that the current water issues on the Sunshine Coast are undertaken and fixed? We'll start first with Mr. Avi Lewis. 2 minutes.
Add yet another to the emergencies that we face. Stage 4 water restrictions on the Sunshine Coast. I'm watching my garden die, like so many other people, and it's devastating. And you know, the water crisis on the Sunshine Coast is deeply connected to the climate emergency. The heat and the heat waves, the drought, are all escalating what is already a shortage. And we have an increasing population on the coast. So we actually we're in a part of history now where we need big change. I mean, we can talk about, you know, it's impressive when you hear all the policy suggestions from all the different parties. We got to focus in on what is actually required, the level of change that's required. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the network of the world's great scientists who advise governments on climate, said that in order to have even a chance at a safe future for everyone on Earth, we need rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society.
1 minute.
We are overdue for many of these changes because we have 19th century energy systems, we have early 20th century transportation and housing systems that are broken, that are failing the challenges of the 21st century. And so here on the Sunshine Coast, we have ample groundwater resources, but we have a water system that's designed around the notion that there's endless water in lakes. And now human-driven climate change is evaporating those lakes and those water supplies in droughts and heat waves. We need 21st century infrastructure in place, water quality approach to sharing the water resources here. There's only one level of government that has the financial capacity to start rolling out new infrastructure systems, 21st century green infrastructure, including water infrastructure to access groundwater on the Sunshine Coast, is part of a Green New Deal, a response to the climate emergency that actually makes the big changes that we need to make in all of the sectors that are in crisis right now. Water is one of the big ones, but it's just not the only one.
Thanks, Abby. The alarm did go off, just not very loud there. We'll move on to Mr. Doug Bebb.
Well, I'm afraid that poor Avi doesn't understand the problem at all. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And in Avi's case, all he has is a crisis, most of them imagined. Water has long been a problem on the Central Coast. Why is it that nothing's been done about this? Leading up to the 2019 election, I talked to Darnell Seegers, the mayor of Seashelt, and there's 3 proposals on the table: raising the dam at Chapman, side storage along Chapman Creek, a pipeline from Clohome possibly to Porpoise Bay. There's plenty of rainfall on the coast. The problem is storage. And going back into the backstory on this lack of storage, there was a proposal to raise the dam, was kiboshed by the NDP NDP provincially, which in fact is the same entity as the NDP federally. So the reason we don't have progress on this is the NDP government and wrangling over all sorts of nonsense. Okay, so not being one for half measures myself, my preference would be for the Clohome Lake option, which, without having studied the engineering proposals in detail, my guess would be probably an underwater pipeline down Salmon Inlet might be the best routing. So it turns out that pipelines might not be a bad thing after all. Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Okay, moving on, we'll start up with Mr. Mike Simpson.
Years ago I was working in West Africa, which doesn't have a lot of water nor a lot of rainfall, and it was amazing to watch in the middle of a war, Doctors Without Borders come in and install potable water function for an entire community in 3 weeks. The question is, how can they do it, and yet we live in a rainforest where we have an abundance of water, and somehow we don't have water coming out of the taps in a few weeks, and the hospital may not have water. And when you talk to local public officials, they say they're actually not sure what they're going to do. That's actually a public policy failure. And it's not a public policy failure that we can plant on local municipalities because they get less than 10% of your tax dollar. If you're watching this tonight, they don't have the access to the funds. Abby's completely correct. The feds have the power here in terms of money. And this is actually something that is exacerbated by not just one thing. It's definitely a climate change problem, and we have to adapt to climate change and increasing droughts. There's no question about that. Our water supply dwindles in the summer because of drought. But it's also a pipeline issue around the Chapman Creek. There are access waters to springs and wells, but the actual technical permits are not in place to get that water. And we will eventually get water out of the aquifer potentially.
1 minute.
But it's going to require the levels of government to come together, to talk to each other, and to figure this out as if it is an emergency, and to act like those folks do in Doctors Without Borders, where they look at it and they go, this is actually an emergency. This is water. This is a climate change emergency. We got to put our heads together and facilitate a solution. And I think that's what we advocate in the Green Party is we start saying, okay, it's not your fault, not your fault, not your fault. There's a combination of factors that have come together here. And we can talk all day about whose fault it is, or we can get on with the solution, which is to quickly make sure that we can store water, most importantly, conserve water, because it is by far more cost effective to conserve water than it is to try to find more water or treat more water. And then finally, what we have to do is we have to talk with everybody in our community so that everybody has a better understanding of how we're going to be able to move through the coming years, where this problem is only going to get far worse because of climate change and the climate change adaptation that we're going to have to be able to facilitate.
Great, thanks for your time, Mike. Moving on, we'll hear from Mr. John Weston.
Well, if I'm sitting here, a middle-class person, hearing all of this debate, I'm asking, how do I solve the problem? There's water on the Sunshine Coast. When I was MP, I recall distinctly that Gibsons was awarded the best water in the world in 2009, and we were also proud of that. Everybody who's spoken so far has acknowledged we live in a rainforest. There's lots and lots of water. So what do we need? I mean, there's obviously cooperation between levels of government, totally essential. Even if the federal government had the will and had the means, it couldn't proceed without the cooperation of other levels of government. So the first thing that you need is ongoing engagement. So when I was member of Parliament in this riding, we had an office here in the Sunshine Coast. For sure, we would have an office here again. So we would have ears and eyes on the ground so that we know what's going on with local government, with local leaders, and with the average person on the coast, so we absolutely are in touch with their needs. Secondly, you need an infrastructure plan. You know, the Liberals announced today $180 billion as part of their new program.
1 minute.
You know that they had they spent something like a third of their infrastructure funds committed in the last mandate. They had a bank called the Canadian Infrastructure Bank that spent only a small portion, and it was known more for its scandals on rewarding its senior executives for big salaries than getting anything done. So we need an infrastructure plan that's actually going to work. We need good cooperation, and the Conservative plan includes both of those things.
Thank you, John. Moving on, Patrick Weiler.
the challenge that municipalities have in raising tax revenue. They don't have the revenue raising ability that the provincial or federal government has. And that's why we've actually doubled what used to be called the gas tax, which is now called the Canada Community Building Fund, to get that no strings attached money directly to municipalities to use on projects that will address things that are of community needs. That's made a huge difference. I've been talking, like I said before, I have bi-weekly meetings with elected officials on the Sunshine Coast, and water is one of those issues that comes up all the time. And it is an emergency. You know, we have a fund that was brought up. It's a 12-year, $180 billion fund. This has been in existence for a few years. And how it works is you apply to this fund. You have a fund specifically focused on green infrastructure and water. It provides 70% federal funding, 30% provincial funding to actually build these types of projects. It's built a number of projects on the Sunshine Coast already, such as the stormwater project in Gibsons, also drinking water projects in Pender, Madeira, and Seychelles. And the challenge we have right now is that it is such an urgency. And that's why the SCRD has had to go through the AAP process to install water meters. Because as Mike said, the most effective way of dealing with the water crisis we have here is being able to identify leaks. And so that process is already proceeding. I would very much suggest for folks that this is an issue that isn't going to go away with a rapidly changing climate where we're going to have drier and hotter summers. And this fund remains available. It's going to open back up for applications in the fall. And I really do hope one of those applications are going to come from the SCRD and the municipalities here. And one of the projects that's on tap to do this is the Church Well Road project. The challenge is it's already been applied for, but it's been held up with regulations at the provincial level. That will be the next step. But
Thanks,
there's still a lot
Patrick.
more work to do.
Thank you very much for your comments. Moving on, Mr. Terry Grimwood.
Doug and I are the only people at the original venue, so we get lots of attention here. The water, to me, water is, I like to refer to infrastructure things as small ball. Anybody that's played baseball or basketball would know what the term small ball means. Instead of trying to hit a home run, you have someone bunt, steal bases, that sort of thing in baseball. And the whole country needs to think small ball, especially with our military and the Air Force, the Navy, the Army. We need to basically look after our country. And water shouldn't be a problem. We should have water trucks. And people should have tanks. You want to have a nice garden? You need a water tank. And when I was a child, they delivered oil to my family home frequently for the furnace. So, let's think in terms of small ball. Let's think in terms of water tanks and trucks to deliver it. But we have water all around us. Who's funding, what federal department is funding desalination? Why aren't we taking water from the Gulf of Georgia? What's the problem? We have the technology today to have desalination plants. They're used in the Middle East. That's where they get 90% of their water. So we don't have any governments or any leaders with any ideas. Now, I don't know how they get elected, but they seem to. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your time. So we'll move on now from water, and we'll move into COVID recovery. So when elected, what will be the economic priorities for your governments to help small business recover from the impacts of the pandemic and help them grow in the future? This question specifically said that benefits are starting to end, and it's going to be a debt process for small business owners. So we'll start first with Doug Bev.
There you go. Oop, you got it? Okay, well, the answer to the end of COVID subsidies is the end of COVID-19 lockdowns. COVID is here to stay, and we're going to eventually have to learn to live with it. Many small business owners where I live have complained to me that the COVID-19 subsidies, and the CERB in particular, have caused severe distortions in the labor market. Nobody should be surprised that people choose CERB over work when CERB pays more. An insidious side effect of this tendency is to increase dependence on government handouts. People cannot become dependent on government without risk of losing their freedom. It's rarely a good idea to bite the hand that feeds you. In order to stop Canada from sliding into a Marxist dictatorship, the People's Party will fire Dr. Theresa Tam and put an end to these subsidies and freedom-destroying medical tyranny. We'll trust Canadians to make their own healthcare decisions based on informed consent, which includes information about alternative therapeutic measures for early treatment. And the topic of this entire nexus between big pharma and government is pretty much the definition of fascism as it was initially defined by Mussolini in the 1930s. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your time. Moving on. I don't think I can. Moving on, we will talk to Mr. Mike Simpson.
So this subject is one that I get very excited about, and I'll tell you why. Because there is not only a wonderful future ahead of us should we choose it. And in ecosystems in the Green Party, we often talk about this concept of resilience. And resilience is your ability, if there's been a shock like COVID or climate change, to be able to adapt and to be able to survive. And what we've done at first here is we've given people a whole bunch of subsidies to keep them alive. But now we're in the phase where coming out of COVID, we need to adapt towards a more resilient future. And a more resilient future for businesses will be one that takes into account some of the coming changes, like climate change, like drought, like fires, like whatever we have going. And so for including COVID, by the way, because COVID doesn't look like it's going to go away quickly. It may be here for a while in different variants. And so the opportunity here is that there are things like, for example, let me give you an example. Decentralized energy production, where people are actually building and installing decentralized energy and putting on solar panels and so on. What a beautiful opportunity that is in clean tech compared to the things that we have to stop, like fossil fuels. I've said numerous times, there's only 128,000 jobs in fossil fuels. There's 420,000 jobs in clean tech, and it will go to 620,000. That's the resilient future that we can invest in which many small business owners can make the shift and adapt and do the pivot. And what's more exciting than that? When we actually think, okay, instead of looking at this as a complete disaster, shift the business and move. And if we rely, that's where the private sector is very, very resilient and adaptive if we give them the
Whatever you say.
And so we can shape those subsidies for the future.
Thank you, Mike. So we're just talking about timing, trying to get as many questions in here as possible before the, it's terrible, before the end here. John Weston, your turn to talk about the COVID recovery.
You know, the question is premised on our emerging from COVID. We're here today because a certain prime minister decided it would be a good idea to have an election during a pandemic. This is the same prime minister who thought it would be a good idea to put the eggs in the basket of getting a company owned by the Communist government of China to produce our vaccines. This is the same prime minister who thought it would be a good idea to dismember our global public health network, which is our due line for pandemics, a year before the pandemic hit us. And the same prime minister who dissipated our supply of medical supplies before we really needed them. And he had the gall 48 hours before calling this election to make an announcement about vaccinating federal employees. So I think everybody has to remember, as we bridge out of COVID, and we all hope we will, that this election, this unnecessary election, which Abby's leader called a selfish election, is happening because of one prime minister. The getting out of COVID means certainly incentivizing businesses, and the Main Street tax credit will provide a 25% tax credit for people who invest in new businesses. I mentioned already the incentives
45 seconds.
back into the workforce who've been out of work for 6 months. There's a 50% subsidy, and new employees, a up to 25% subsidy. So this is a specific ways to get Canada going, and we think we can get 1 million jobs created within a year.
Thank you, John. We'll give time to Mr. Patrick Weiler.
So the best way for us to help small business owners and our economic recovery generally is to finally finish the fight against COVID-19. Canadians are leading the world right now in vaccine procurement and administration, but we're not there yet. And that's why our government has proposed measures to ensure that federally regulated workers and those that travel by interprovincial trains and planes will have to get vaccinated. These are some of the measures. Once we're finally able to get to herd immunity, we're not going to have to be dealing with things like reduced capacity in stores that allow us to finally recover. And it's critical that we do that more than anything else. And I also want to mention, a mention before was made to the CERB. The CERB was actually eliminated last September. The folks that were collecting the CERB got moved on to EI, where we have integrity measures built in that show that people have to be looking for work. The CRB is, again, a measure that was created for people that were gig workers and weren't eligible for EI. Those folks now have access to support as well. Again, with integrity measures built in. When you're talking to businesses on the Sunshine Coast, there are those that are struggling, but so many of them have actually been thriving, particularly in the tourism sector. With less people traveling internationally, or with people not traveling internationally rather, there's actually been a huge boom for some of the business activity. And actually in BC, we have more people employed now than we did before the pandemic. But we know there are those businesses that are continuing to struggle. That's why we've made the promise to extend the Canada Recovery Hiring Benefit, which provides support for businesses to hire or rehire workers. And we're also extending the rent and wage subsidy for some of the hardest hit sectors, including the tourism, hospitality, arts, and cultural sector. My heart really goes out today to Vineet for everything that he's had to go through in the last year and a half with his business. But we're going to help them on the road to recovery by matching ticket sales for performing arts, for live theaters, and other cultural venues to help them get back to where they were before. But really what it starts with is mandating vaccinations wherever we can, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Thank you, Patrick. And we'll now move on to Mr. Terry Grimwood.
It sounds like they've kept the best for last. So, Terry Grimwood, independent candidate. Funding COVID. All we have to do is believe in ourselves and use our own pension funds to fund everything in Canada. We'd get a real synergy from that. Right now, I would suggest that the majority of our pension fund loans internationally are non-performing. But we don't hear anything. The average salaries of $4 or $5 million a year. One person running a pension fund in Canada getting paid $4 to $5 million a year. My approach would be to hire 10 people at $500,000 and get 10 times the productivity. We're stupid. We don't even pay attention. The guy that was running our biggest pension fund in Canada quit 2 days. Quit 2 days before his year end. What's he hiding? He used COVID as an excuse because he's in Dubai or someplace. We have to believe in Canada, and we need to bring our pension funds home. We need to have warehousing in every province for food products that are produced in Canada, made in Canada, because people producing food products today in British Columbia cannot get into the wholesalers. They're owned by American companies, and they're closing us, they're shutting us out. We need to basically believe in ourselves and support ourselves. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tom. And we will conclude this question with Mr. Avi Lewis.
So this question was actually about how do we help small businesses, and I think it's another one that really draws a really clear line between the Tory Liberal approach and the NDP's offer. John talks about incentives, tax credits for Main Street, etc. Those, again, are little incremental measures. People are in an emergency, they need help. And who a government helps really tells you about who they put at the center of their equation, who they really feel accountable to, who they see as their community. My grandfather stood across the floor of the House of Commons from Justin Trudeau's father in the 1972 Parliament. And my grandpa brought Pierre Trudeau down to a minority with a campaign called the Corporate Welfare Bums. And he went across the country looking at just how much public money Pierre Trudeau's government had shoveled into the coffers of corporations. My grandfather would be rolling over in his grave tonight if he could look at the pandemic profiteering that happened in this country.
1 minute.
The billionaire class in Canada increased its wealth by $78 billion in the pandemic. Well, working people, working Canadians were suffering mightily. The NDP forced the Liberal government to double the CERB because the Liberal government's first idea was that people could live on $1,000 a month in 2020, and that was a joke. And we also got the wage subsidy up from 10% to 75%, but we said, be careful, don't do it with no strings attached, otherwise the corporate welfare bums will just hoover up all that public money. And that's exactly what happened. Air Canada executives, bank executives, share buybacks, executive compensation. It was an orgy of private sector feeding at the public trough because the Liberals are happiest when they're shoveling money to the corporate welfare bums, and the Tories even the Tories would be embarrassed by the amount of public money that's been transferred to the wealthiest in our society. The NDP will fight for working people, will actually take care of small businesses, will design programs and redistribute wealth away from the gaping inequality in our society that endangers us all, and support working people. Pharmacare, which the Liberals have been promising since the 1990s, would save small businesses $600
Thanks.
for every employee.
Thanks,
Universal
Abby.
public services are what we need to support small businesses.
Thanks,
and you
Mr.
can only
Lewis.
count on the NDP to fight for that.
Thanks, Mr. Lewis. So we had, just for the candidates' information, we had a bunch more questions laid out, but John indicated that he's going to take off at the top of the hour. So we'll move now into closing statements. We'll move now into closing statements. So we'll give you each 3 minutes. I would love to ask lots more questions too, but we'll give you each 3 minutes, and we'll start with your closing remarks, Mr. Mike Simpson.
Okay, well, I don't want to miss the bigger picture on what was just said around what happened to all of the money, because I think actually I would have loved to entitle this whole thing tonight, just follow the money, because during the CERB thing, if you look at what happened, there was a lot of liquidity that went into the system, and then people ended up putting that money into banks, and look where all the money went. The banks made a fortune. One of your other questions tonight was around e-commerce. Who made the biggest fortune during COVID was Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And how did they do it? They don't get taxed when they're moving courier packages across the border in Canada. Why is that? That's a public policy failure. I would say if we follow the money in Canada, we'll quickly see that all the parties are willing to spend $77 billion on fighter jets. Those are huge chunks of change. Same thing with Amazon. Why is it Airbnb or Netflix or all of these big, huge companies? And if you go on and look who's making all the money, you'll see that the banks are making the money, the big corporations like that are making the money, but why? And what we're saying in the Green Party is that there's actually plenty of money there if you carbon tax that, if you put in taxes in a way in which we can redistribute and have a just and equal society in which those rich people don't get away with that. You're busy looking at your cell phone bill wondering why it's more expensive. In the meantime, Jeff Bezos is making $3,800 every second. So my point is that if we just think and see the bigger picture, we will see very quickly that the Green Party is saying we have global disruptions coming down the line in the next 8 years. Time is running out in terms of making good public policy decisions. The IPCC says 4 more years. COVID has taught us a lesson that if we can cooperate across partisan lines, we can solve issues fairly quickly. And you've seen tonight, parties come together and realize there are some things where we have to get together, and safety is one of them. In the next coming years, we'll see the same thing around climate change. And I'm saying if I can be your MP and go to Ottawa, that is something that I will try to champion. And the number one thing I will try to champion is a climate cabinet that is made up and it represents, according to proportional representation, it has the seats in there that represents Canadians from all parties.
1 minute.
So that we can put our heads together and find the creative solutions that I know exist that are out there to get us through these coming years, which are going to be incredibly disruptive.
Thanks for your time. We'll move on now to Mr. John Weston.
We woke up today with the bad news of a contraction in the Canadian economy, the only of the one of the G7 countries that suffered that. And we're some 250,000 jobs behind the prediction of the Liberal government when they brought in their budget. That budget was only brought in a few months ago. You know, we have a stark choice in this election. We shouldn't even be having an election, but now we're in it, we have a stark choice. On the one hand, we have a comprehensive plan from the Conservatives, 1 million jobs in a year, 1 million houses within 3 years, incentivize small businesses, Main Street, people coming back to work, getting beyond COVID, yes, exercising our freedoms as Canadians to make a choice with our health, but while we're encouraging all Canadians to have the vaccine and delegating to the provinces what they do when it matters of their jurisdiction. We have a stark choice between a party that wanted to shut down Parliament, and thanks to the NDP and the Greens, we stopped the Liberals from doing that. Can you imagine if they had blank checks and could do exactly what they wanted for these months and months of the pandemic? We have an environmental plan that the Conservatives have on offer that will bring about our Paris Accord commitments and GHG reductions. It's a plan that has been validated by Navius, an independent consulting firm that says we will reach those Paris Accord GHG emissions at least as effectively as the Liberals plan to do without wrecking the economy. And in terms of accountability, never again will we have a Prime Minister who has committed 3 ethical violations. We'll bring about more stringent accountability measures, actual fines for the kinds of things that Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau did. So I'm asking you to consider me as part of the Conservative team. I served for 7 years. It would be an honor to be back.
One minute.
Yes, I'm going to roll up those sleeves. I'm going to work hard. We're going to have an office in the Sunshine Coast, and we're going to get out of this pandemic together. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Moving on, we'll look for closing remarks from Mr. Patrick Weiler.
Thank you, Keith, and I do want to thank all those folks tuning in and pivoting to be able to do this. And today was actually a really important day. Today we released our platform, and you will see it's the only costed platform of any of the parties that are speaking today. And through this platform, we've provided clear figures that provide a fiscal ankle, including having a steadily declining debt to GDP ratio. And I think this is really important because Canadians need to have all the information at their fingertips when they're making this important decision on September 20th. And I do want to mention the Conservatives often think of themselves as the party of fiscal prudence. But actually, before the pandemic hit, 75% of Canada's debt in its entire 150-year history was racked up under the 2 previous Conservative prime ministers. Going forward here, we've made a very clear plan to address the topics that we talked about today. We have the most robust policy to tackle the housing crisis. We have a plan to get our economy back on its feet, and that starts with finishing the fight against COVID-19 and dealing with some of the scarring that we've seen over the last 2 years and dealing with some of the challenges that we've seen throughout our country. I also want to mention the inaccuracy that John mentioned before about their climate plan. The Conservative climate plan is going to roll us back to where the country was under Harper. A 30% below 2005 level is completely insufficient to fight the climate crisis, and they do it in a disingenuous way of using carbon pricing in a way that actually incentivizes you to pollute more. We cannot go back to the way that we were governed under the Harper Conservatives. We need to keep moving forward to better, and we're going to do this in a way that not only fights climate change, protects the environment, but we're going to do it in a way that grows the economy. We're going to continue to invest in areas like clean tech, and we are actually the only party that has a credible plan to fight climate change. And those are not my words. Those are the words of Andrew Weaver, former head of the BC Green Party and IPCC scientist. you know, I've had the honor and privilege of being your MP for the last 2 years. It's been the honor of my life to represent the communities I grew up in, and many of the topics we talked about today, the work has started, but it's not done. And I hope you'll put your trust in me to continue to represent you so that we can keep moving our country forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. We'll move on to Mr. Terry Grimwood. Yikes. And you'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I have Mr. Weiler's brochure here, and the first bold climate action. I've been involved in federal politics now for 3 years. My first entered into the by-election in South Burnaby, where Mr. Singh was elected. And at that time, forest fires were headlines in our newspapers all summer long. And they were headlines in our newspapers for many years prior. And there's still headlines in our newspapers from day to day. I introduced myself to the new mayor of Burnaby at that time. He was a fire chief. And I said to him, firefighting in Canada needs to be a federal issue, not this responsibility of the provinces. They don't have the revenue to do it. And he agreed with me. The federal government has done nothing. Mr. Trudeau on my cell phone the other day suggested he was going to provide funding for another, or training for another 1,000 firefighters and some money for equipment. That's a joke. That is a joke. We've got the second largest landmass in the world. They've got more people cutting lawn in Ottawa than 1,000 people. We need to take it seriously. The civil servants just got paid sick leave. Prior to getting that, for I think it's 10 days paid sick leave. They already have dental. When are we going to get dental for our seniors and children? 85% of Canadians have problems with their wisdom teeth. Civil servants who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year get free dental. How about a senior on a pension? I know people in this community without subsidies get less than $900 a month. What does that pay for? To live in your car? You know, we just need to really look at what we're paying our civil servants. They're getting they got a raise. All of these members of parliament got a raise the day they were elected. Within days of being elected, they all got a raise. It may have been 2%, I don't know what it was. But when you're getting 2% of 200,000, you're getting $4,000. 2% of $1,000 pension is $20.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here today.
Thank you, Terry. Oh, so we will finish off, not finish off, no, sorry. Mr. Avi Lewis, you'll go next.
At the risk of agreeing with my new friend John Weston yet again, I do think that Canadians face a really stark choice in this election. When it comes to the climate emergency, you can have Tory denial or you can have Liberal delay. Going back to the Harper targets is climate denial. The party, John, your party was unable to pass a resolution saying that the climate emergency is real at your convention. And Patrick, we were both in Paris in 2015 when Justin had his "we're back" moment and Canada was going to ride to the rescue and be a climate champion. And yet, thanks to buying pipelines, relentlessly subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, Canada's the only country in the G7 whose emissions have increased since Paris. And go down the list. The Tories and the Liberals teamed up together in this last Parliament to vote against making the ultra-rich and big corporations pay their fair share of taxes. They voted against universal pharmacare that would eliminate the cost of medicines for Canadians. They teamed up and voted against protecting seniors in long-term care, where profitable corporations are extracting value from abandoning seniors. And in a pandemic, that was horrific, the consequences. We have a long legacy in this country of two old parties that serve the interests of the elite. And there is one party which offers a starkly different path. In my family, we've been fighting for the better part of a century. My grandpa was one of the founders of the CCF, and in the 1930s, they were fighting for the interests of the 99% against the 1%. And that was language that my grandpa used in the early 1940s. We are the party that advanced and brought to the country universal Medicare, the fundamental right to health for all people, not because they're wealthy, not because they got lucky by birth, not because they got lucky by social station, but because they're human beings. And we have to complete that dream.
1 minute.
Canadians believe deeply in universal public services, and there's only one party that has decade after decade after decade fought for basic human rights for all, not just the profits of the corporate elite, and that's the NDP. The NDP has fought for working people in the pandemic. We succeeded in getting improvements for the supports that people desperately needed. We have the best climate plan we've ever had. We are the climate party now. I know Mike takes issue with that, but the truth is that the carbon budgets, the independence of the Climate Accountability Office, and the courage to stand up to polluting corporations and say, enough, we have to slash our emissions in half in less than a decade, and we can do it by creating millions of jobs in zero emissions housing, in the zero emissions public transportation system that will connect the communities across this great land, in all of the Green New Deal policies that will make the huge changes we have to make and benefit working people in their daily lives starting right away. That's the choice that faces Canadians in this election, and I believe that we have the wisdom to make the right one.
Thank you, Avi. And finally, we'll move to Mr. Doug Bed.
Okay. Well, the Liberals have called an unnecessary election. Is that plugged in? Start now? The Liberals have called an unnecessary election, and they've made vaccine passports the primary issue. It's time to look at the facts. Clear evidence exists that vaccinated people can still catch COVID. Clear evidence also exists that vaccinated people can still spread COVID. It should be clear then that vaccine passports offer no benefit from a public health standpoint. Trudeau's policy on this is simply delusional fantasy. What then is the true purpose of vaccine passports? From the SNC-Lavalin affair to the Aga Khan affair to the weed charity scandal to the latest attempt to nullify Parliament through the courts in order to avoid producing incriminating documents that might implicate Winnipeg Laboratory in the COVID mess, the Liberals have shown contempt for the Canadian people, for our democratic processes, and have left us with a clear impression that they evaluate every program on the basis of whether or not it can be used to their own benefit. There's no reason to believe the promises they make here today will be any different. Simply put, they do not deserve another term in office. When our leader, Maxime Bernier, quit the Conservative Party of Canada, he called it intellectually and morally corrupt. And it didn't take long for the CPC to prove him correct. They hired former Liberal mudslinger Warren Kinsella at over $20,000 per month to run a smear campaign against us. Kinsella is now the subject of a defamation lawsuit for falsely labeling us as racists. In fact, the People's Party of Canada is running candidates of every ethnicity, every color, and every orientation. I can tell you for a fact that our head policy writer is a gay man, but the most important thing about him is not that he's gay. The most important thing is that he writes good policy succinctly and eloquently in both official languages. The People's Party is the party of freedom. We believe in a small government and in the sanctity of individual rights. Foremost among these is the right to free speech, without which a citizenry cannot stand in peaceful opposition to government coercion. And without that, democracy fails. The People's Party is the sensible, in fact, the only alternative to the current corruption in Ottawa. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your time. Well, that concludes the formal debate process. I would just like to thank everyone at home who came, who watched us today, and the people in the crowd. I'd like to thank all the candidates for showing up. And, oh, I need to stop the timer. Yeah, that's your time. Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. It's very important to me personally that people get involved in the democratic process. And so thank you very much for everybody who came out, and thanks for the solution that we came up with. I look forward to talking to one of you men at Parliamentary Talkback come September or come October. So we'll see you guys, and thank you very much on behalf of myself, the Chamber of Commerce and here in Gibsons, as well as all the thousands and cast of thousands in the background. We thank you, and you have yourself a great evening.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.